Historians will devote much time to examine why the Assad father and son dynasty crashed after 54 years. Was it the weakness of their backers that proved the tipping point? Hezbollah had just had their leadership wiped out in Beirut. Iran was bracing itself for a second attack by Israel. Had Russia, whose aerial firepower proved so decisive in 2016, become overstretched by fighting two wars at once? There were also strong internal factors to explain why the army collapsed like a house of cards. Poor pay, low morale, corruption, a near universal hatred of the dynasty that ruled Syria with an iron hand. It's all looking a lot like the Arab Spring 13 years ago. But are we witnessing a revolution bursting into flames again from the embers of a fire that was never fully stamped out? Books have been written, careers launched on the premise that the Arab Spring is dead, and there's lots of evidence for it. 13 years have passed, and the split that tore the coalition of revolutionaries in Tahrir Square apart is still there. And what happened in Tunisia? Didn't they think themselves so much more sophisticated than their brothers in Egypt? And hadn't they followed Egypt down the same path to jail and dictatorship? Back then, in 2011, Syria was hailed as the object lesson Arabs were told to avoid. Every government told its people not to rock the boat, to avoid the bloodshed taking place in Daraa. But it is here that the revolution could be starting up all over again. It's the same scenes of toppling statues, ripped pictures, the joy of protesters climbing on tanks, the horror of discovering emaciated prisoners in Sednaya prison. I was in Doha at the annual forum at the time all this was taking place, and you could see the tectonic plates of the region shifting in the body language of the delegates. The blood seemed to drain from the face of Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who became intensely uncomfortable fielding questions about Syria and demanded to talk about Russian success in Ukraine instead. The Iranian delegation rushed in a huddle through the corridors of the Sheraton Hotel, ashen-faced. Conversely, the Turks were ruling the roost. Almost overnight, the Syrian revolution had turned Turkey from a distressed observer into a player once more in the Middle East. Hakan Fidan, the foreign minister, and Ibrahim Kalin, the man in charge of Turkey's intelligence organization, were stars again. There is still fighting in the north between the Turkish-backed Free Syria Army and the US-backed YPD Kurds, but so far the toppling of Assad has been peaceful. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham reassured the Christians of Aleppo. It handed over governance to policemen as soon as rebel troops could withdraw. They left the Sayyida Zainab shrine in South Damascus untouched and did not confront Iraqi paramilitary groups. The rebels kept the road open to Latakia for retreating Syrian army generals to flee. Learning the lessons of Iraq, they stopped looting and told the cheering crowds to respect government property. HTS leader Abu Mohammed al-Jolani gave his victory speech in the historic Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, which is adjacent to the resting place of Saladin. Absolutely no one in the Muslim world, or indeed the Arab world, would have lost the significance of these symbols. The reaction of the pro-Iranian secular left in the West has been to tar the HTS as unreformed jihadis, head cutters and oppressors of minorities, all trained by the CIA and now working in Israel's interests. However, the Palestinian militant groups, most of whom have been funded by Iran, had a very different reaction, and no one can accuse Hamas of being CIA or pro-Israeli. Hamas said that Syria will continue to play an historic and pivotal role in supporting the Palestinian people. And a senior Palestinian source who knows the thinking inside the movement told me, every free person in the world should be happy about what happened in Syria, whether they're Christian, Jewish or Muslim, because the situation in Syria was very, very clear. This was the worst example of genocidal attacks towards a people whose only crime was to call for reform, freedom and social justice. Now, Hamas concedes that Assad's fall is bad news for Hezbollah and Iran, both comrades in arms. But it continues to think the relationship between Hamas and these groups will not change. There is no arguing that the collapse of Assad is a major strategic loss for Iran. However, the axis of resistance is far from dismantled because Hezbollah and the Iraqi armed groups like Kataib Hezbollah and Ansar Allah, the Houthis in Yemen, are still functioning fighting forces. But what would be a greater threat to Israel's plans for a messianic hegemony to dominate its neighbours would be the emergence of a successful Islamist neighbour, to show the Arab people how the weak can topple the strong. Which is why Israel's first reaction was to occupy the demilitarized border zone and strategic mountain peak in Mount Hermon range between Syria and Lebanon. They claim their presence is temporary, but temporary in the Middle East can last a very long time. If this does indeed turn out to be the start of a new chapter in the Arab Spring, at least one lesson will have been learned. The revolutionaries in Egypt and Tunisia were not revolutionary enough. Armed revolt was not in the Muslim Brotherhood's DNA. Quite the contrary. They kept being seduced by false assurances from the Egyptian military that the army would allow a freely elected government to rule. Their tools were political only. They attempted to assemble this flat-pack kit called democracy by dutifully reading the instructions and screwing it together piece by piece. Meanwhile, the generals laughed and kicked down this cardboard construction with hobnail boots. The Syrian revolution, if it indeed continues as it started, toppled the army, the deep state, the secret police, the prisons by force of arms. If it does succeed, Syria could provide a powerful lesson in how a rebel movement gains national legitimacy, and success in this brittle region is contagious. That is why right now there must be more than one despot quietly plotting how to derail the experiment as they so successfully did a decade ago. Or is their counter-revolutionary toolkit out of date? To a large extent that depends on the Syrian people themselves, but it is well past the time that Egyptians, Jordanians, Tunisians, Iraqis rethink their understanding of revolutions. They wax and wane, but they don't die.